Welcome to Cypher After Hours. In today's episode, we're going to continue our discussion on Operation High Jump and a mysterious journal that was supposedly left behind by Admiral Byrd about a legendary flight that he took over the South Pole. Supposedly, he saw UFOs, got into a dogfight with the UFOs, discovered the inner Earth through the Great Door in Antarctica, and many other things. We're going to look into that. Thank you, everyone, for being a subscriber and supporting the show. We really appreciate it. It helps us bring you shows like this. But with that, let's just jump into this. Emily, why don't you kick it off? You're the master researcher. Where do we begin on this epic saga of Admiral Byrd?
To set the scene, we start out at a base camp that Admiral Byrd had set up. They called it the Forward Base Camp, Little America, right next to the ice cliff where the ships could dock. But then in order to get out deeper into the continent with their aircraft was more or less like a makeshift airport that was just a few hundred miles in towards the South Pole. And then from that point, they could actually coordinate all of their flights. So their flights actually started from this point, which was a little bit further in, and they could venture out further to do all of their scientific explorations.
Emily, I think something that I know the remote viewers always want to know is what was the exact tasking that you used for us on this particular remote viewing project?
So the exact tasking we used was Operation High Jump, officially titled the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, January 1947, Admiral Richard Byrd's flight past the South Pole. So the first task we had actually just looked at the Operation High Jump, and this was specifically targeted at the flight that he had over the South Pole, because we really wanted to know, okay, there's this legend here. Is the legend real? Of course, as remote viewers, that's what we want to find out. What truth, if any, is behind these stories? And I think that we came up with some very, perhaps unexpected to some listeners, discoveries. Brett, why don't you get into some of your data? What did you find in terms of the life? You called it a life form, I believe, but really you didn't know it was Admiral Byrd. And I think that's our interpretation of your data, right? That you keyed in on a life form that was central.
Yeah, I had a person here who, he went through quite an experience, and we're going to get into the details of those as we go along here. I had a person who was in this snowed, very cold, desolate environment, and my understanding of who he was, I already mentioned a little bit of this in the main show, but it sets the premise for this, is he's an investigator. He was there looking for something. And whether that was Nazis, whether that was resources and minerals, whether that was something unknown, which is perhaps one of our postulates we'll talk about later. Maybe it's none of the above. It's something that nobody knows. It was part of the official mission. He was out looking for something. It wasn't just a stroll in the park. And it felt like he was hired for this task. And while it wasn't your typical contract job, he was part of the Navy, and they kind of deployed him on this mission. So this is why I believe that this life form and all the data that I got with this specific person, the individual, I got it was a male, that it was a man who was in this situation, why I believe all this data applies to him.
And that makes sense because that was part of the tasking. We really had you look at Admiral Byrd's flight, so it makes sense that your data would be centered around Admiral Byrd himself. So getting into the actual flight, Admiral Byrd had this goal of getting out over the South Pole. So there's the actual geographic South Pole of planet Earth, and his goal was to fly out over it and see what was sort of past the edge of the South Pole. I guess that's the wrong way of saying it. It's more like they're coming at it from a particular direction. The South Pole is sort of in the center of the continent, and they wanted to fly over the pole further inland, further to the center of the actual landmass and see what was out there. So he started out in his flight. He was taking photos. He was sitting there in his aircraft, observing, hunting, and that's when things started to get kind of weird. There was a malfunction in his instruments, and this is some of the information we know from his diary, but we actually have accounts of other people at the base where there was a 3-hour window of not missing time, but where the aircraft was missing off of radar and radio communications for 3 hours. And so this correlates to some of the data that we got from Admiral Byrd's supposed diary of this encounter. He says that his instruments started to malfunction. Obviously, if you're flying over the South Pole or the North Pole, you're not going to get great compass readings because you're right over the kind of the magnetic part of the planet where it's the compass is spinning around anyhow. So they were using radios to help orient themselves. They had a sun compass, so they knew at a certain time of day where the sun would be in the sky, and the sun could actually be used as a compass. And but they were reporting that their gyroscopes were acting strangely. So the gyroscopes are these little things that spin around, and they shouldn't matter sort of which way you're oriented. Actually, even up in space, the gyroscope maintains its position a certain way, but these things were wobbling all over the place. And so this really gets into some very strange activity that was occurring on this flight. And Brett, maybe this is a good place for you to share. What did you pick up as it relates to, or as you think it relates to, Admiral Byrd's actual flight in your RV data?
Yes, when I looked at the flight, I immediately picked up on that the life form itself was inside of an enclosed metal container. And if you think about the airplane that he was flying in, that matches exactly the case. I got the idea that there were windows in it. You could peer out and beyond through a cockpit, that there was a way to steer this thing. It's funny because my descriptions of it were something like, it reminds me of like a hippie van in the sense that it's got these pinstripes along the side, a bunch of seats in the interior. You can drive it places. I just didn't quite pick up that it was actually an airplane. I thought it was perhaps more of a ground vehicle. There were lots of ground vehicles at the site before he would have taken off on this journey. But ultimately, I think where I landed was him inside of the aircraft. He would have had a pilot. The flight was filmed, I believe, or at least one of them was. So likely if someone with a camera, who knows who else would have been on the flight with him. But this is where my remote viewing story begins with him, is inside of this metal hatch. Now, one thing before I go into the actual description of what happens next, one of the interesting things that, if you'll believe the journal, and we'll talk about this maybe in a little bit, about the origins of this supposed secret lost diary, Admiral Byrd, I believe, is credited for saying that, quote, "I'd like to see the land beyond the pole, the area beyond the pole in the center of the great unknown." So it was a big mystery for him. And this is really in alignment with where I start with him, is he's out there as an investigator. He wants to know what's over the great beyond. And he's looking out these windows almost with a hushed, held breath kind of demeanor, like he's anxious. There's really a lot of anxiety with this individual. I described them in the remote viewing work as sitting in a curled up position inside of this hollow metal object. There's something outside of the box that the person is peeking at and observing from afar. They aren't quite sure what it is, but they are shocked and distressed by it. They keep thinking themselves, what am I seeing? What am I seeing? And we'll go into that in a minute, but he's having this reaction to what he's perceiving outside of the windows from this area that he's positioned within inside the airplane. The person is very nervous. They're scared inside of this big metallic object that's enclosing them, and they appear to be very confused about what they're witnessing in that great beyond.
So I think there's more than one explanation for why he might be confused about what he's perceiving visually. I think if we get into the diary now, and we can see what it's claimed that he experienced on that fateful flight.
Looking at the diary itself, Admiral Byrd describes that he flew over this mountain range that he had never seen before. I guess he'd done flights in the area, but he claims that he flew over this mountain range that he hadn't noticed prior to this current flight. And he saw this lush green valley down below. So just foliage, trees, forest, that sort of a thing. And he sees a large creature in this valley. And at first he thinks it's an elephant, but then he looks closer and realizes it's a woolly mammoth. And so he's just astounded by this, the fact that he's literally in the middle of this Arctic tundra wasteland, just snow and ice as far as the eye can see. And here's this lush green valley. And he notices that it's no longer cold. The temperature seems very warm. All of the ice on the wings, the frost, everything's gone. And lo and behold, as he's flying around through this valley, these two saucer-like UFOs apparently come up wing to wing beside his aircraft. and gently escort his aircraft down to the ground. There's apparently a runway, and he's landed by these two UFOs.
Do they escort him, or I thought they take control of the plane, don't they? And the engine dies, and they sort of tractor beam him down.
Yeah, there's a bit of a manipulation or a guidance. I guess escort isn't quite the right word. It's more of a coercion. But yeah, it guides the plane down to the ground. Like, no, you're coming with us, and down you go, basically.
So who does he meet when he gets down to the ground?
So the story goes that there are these very tall human-like beings that are referred to as Aryans, and that they're basically expecting Admiral Byrd. They're like, they know his name. Hello, Admiral Byrd. You're coming with us. We want to take you to our master, who's going to have a chat with you. So all of this seems pretty fantastical. And what's even more interesting is when you look at the diary, you've got Admiral Byrd just jotting down kind of minute by minute these details. Okay, now at this timestamp, I'm landing. This moment, these beings are coming up to the door of my plane. Oh, I'm gonna put my pen now and go with them. And he's writing this in his journal. It seems very odd the way that the journal is written, because if you were in this situation, the last thing you'd be thinking about is writing all this stuff down.
This sounds more like a screenplay than a journal, doesn't it?
Exactly. It sounds like someone's writing a story. I mean, we hear all these encounters of people who see incredible things, UFOs and Bigfoot and so on. The last thing they think of is grabbing their camera, let alone their journal, and just in this state of shock, writing it all down. So at the very least, I think we can say that this is perhaps a recounting of what happened in the form of a journal entry, as opposed to it being an actual journal entry. I think that's the first sort of clue as we unravel this mystery, that it's not an actual journal entry, but at the very least, a recounting of what happened.
Even if it is based on truth, it's a dramatic recreation. Is that the most generous we can be about this document?
Well, I think if you take a critical eye on the source of these stories, first of all, the journal wasn't discovered until long after Admiral Byrd died. If I'm right, Emily, on this, it was his son who apparently found it, gave it to some group. It ended up in published other documents. I mean, you can find it on Amazon in kind of a butchered form. The Secret Lost Diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd and the Phantom of the Poles, which you can find there. But that's parts of the journal kind of cut and pasted in this other document that a different author it's just full of nonstop speculation and almost fantasy writing, that he is then taking these little bits of trivia and quotes from explorers and tying them all together, kind of shoestring, to make this narrative of the grand inner earth, the great door beyond, etc. But there's like only these little snippets supposedly that came from his journal. That, how true are they? Well, maybe we should look at what the RV data says.
I should also note here that the journal did come out almost a decade after the actual event. So it's, as Brett pointed out correctly, that there are some very dubious origins to this particular journal. And it's sort of this thing that was surfaced into the public space after Admiral Byrd died, and at least sort of 10 years later. So, and at this time when it was released, there was a lot of pop culture lore. After the big UFO craze with Kenneth Arnold and the whole cultural iconography of the classic saucer shape in the pop culture.
With regards to the dates of this, I'm interested in how long it came out after he died, because you can see, if you're going to give it every generosity and benefit of the doubt, you can see why he wouldn't want it released until after his death. People do posthumous memoirs the whole time where they dish the dirt and they say what they wouldn't have been able to say when they were living. But if he dies and then like 10 years later all these movies come out and suddenly this journal appears, or is it like 1 year after he dies? How much time passes, do you know, in between his death and the release of the journal?
I'm not sure if we have a very clear understanding of the actual timeline. I did a little bit of digging on that, and it's just the whole way that this journal came out. I don't think there's any really super cut and dry data that we can look at for this. It's really kind of murky, and that's another big detractor in terms of, is this thing really completely on the up and up? Basically, the question we have to ask is, how seriously do we take this particular story, considering the origins of the diary combined with just how fantastical this actual account is. Because it doesn't just stop at him going to see this Aryan master. There's a whole other message that he comes back with. So although the origin of the diary has its own questionable circumstances, I think that what comes after in the content of the diary, or what comes after him meeting this Aryan master, is also quite, well, let's just say, interesting. David, did you want to get into what's the message that he's given, and what is he supposed to share with the rest of humanity?
Well, I think the message he's given is about how the Ariani, if that's how you say it sounds to me like somebody took the word Aryan and tried to make it sound like it was a character from Doctor Who, but the Ariani have been observing humans for a long time, the secret watchers, look at that. And that we are, humans that is, too immature for atomic energy. And the reason that these people have chosen Admiral Byrd to deliver this message to humanity is because when they fly their flying saucers out in a valiant attempt to make contact with humans and tell us how immature and stupid we are, we shoot at them and we get into fights with their flying saucers. So they've decided, because Byrd is such a reputable and overachieving fellow, that he will be the one to carry this message back and deliver it to humanity, which, as we can see from the fact that he never spoke a word about this, he manifestly failed to do. So it doesn't speak volumes for the Ariani's judgment for their choice of messenger.
Right. So the Arianis were able to orchestrate Admiral Byrd somehow showing up to their situation, to their base, to their Arctic paradise, and yet they couldn't foresee how he might get stuck with his higher ups and he might get problems with the Pentagon, and actually bringing this message to the world. It was like they managed to orchestrate this really odd set of events, but then simultaneously lacked the understanding that this would just be kind of dead in the water, that there was no practical way a guy like him could have actually said this out loud in public and be allowed to speak and say these things. It doesn't make any sense.
So he was allegedly then debriefed at the Pentagon for hours, and he never spoke of it again. But there's no evidence that he actually ever spoke of it in the first place, is there really? He was debriefed. Of course he was. He was the admiral in charge of the thing. He'd come back, and some people had died, and lots of planes fell in the sea, and the submarine had to come home. Of course, he did have to have a little debrief session to say, where is all of our military hardware? And then he could say, well, it's at the bottom of the sea. Let me tell you a story about ice. There's nothing to suggest that his debriefing necessarily contained anything that is in this alleged journal.
So my remote viewing data on the subject is interesting when trying to match it to the stories of this suspect journal, because I do have some information that he's looking out the window of his tin box in astonishment, and he's amazed. And I also did have something like a transmission that was being sent to where he was, and that was significant to what was going on. Now, nothing about an underground civilization came up in my session work. And as Emily has already stated, the way that they navigated and traveled in the Arctic regions was by radio. Compasses didn't work. The other stuff didn't work down there. So it makes sense that their airplane would be having radio messages going back and forth for navigation and all other sorts of things. And actually, I drew a little radio tower as well as a base camp, which will come into play in a minute here as far as what the remote viewing data is asserting. But there is nothing in the work that said that the UFO showed up, that they landed an airplane, that he spoke with some really mystical figure. And I'll tell you, if there was a mystical underground figure and a master of an unknown race, boy, oh boy, would that be incredibly numinous to a remote viewer. That would be the very first thing I would have gone to. And yet I don't. I get him in a plane, in a little box, staring in amazement. The real question is why?
Well, just to add to your point quickly there about, as a remote viewer, you would be drawn to that like a moth to a flame. But what if the technology of the Ariani is so advanced that they can block out our psychic signal and prevent remote viewers from discovering the important message that they desperately wanted us to hear in the first place? Wait,
Sounds like you have a bestseller on your hands.
Would be somewhat self-defeating.
So that still leaves us with, well, what did happen during the 3 hours when the plane lost radio contact with the main base? It was in constant radio contact, and it disappeared off of the tracking, the radar. The plane flew off, and they didn't even know at that point in time, back at his forward base camp, whether he was ever coming back. They were thinking, okay, do we have to mount a search party? Where would we even start looking? This plane was flying for hundreds of miles across barren, open, snowy wastelands, and so it wasn't even clear that Admiral Byrd was ever coming back at this point in time. Brett, did you have anything that you think that happened in your RV data that relates to this time when he went missing, basically for 3 hours?
I did, because when I moved the story forward in the RV session, I get a very peculiar description of Byrd and his mindset during the events that unfolded. Because I see him looking out these windows, but he's in a very different state of mind. There's something that's happened to his cognitive functioning that is off. When I looked at him, he was curled up in a ball inside this tin container. He was having a cold sweat. He was, from his own perception, seemingly looking out a window. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized that that's actually not what was happening. What was happening is I checked out his position and I realized he's not actually looking out a window here. He thinks he's looking out a window. He's actually passed out. I'm describing him on this flight as being unconscious and having hallucinations of things that are outside the window. I'm not sure if anyone of our listeners has had the experience when they've had a false awakening in the morning, where they've gone to bed, they think they get up, their alarm goes off, they stand up, they think they've woken up for the day, ready to get started, but they're still in the dream. This is the kind of vibe I was getting from his experience that was going on the airplane.
There's also that phenomenon where if you're sleeping quite lightly but you're dreaming and there's a strange noise in your environment, it will be incorporated into your dream, and your dream will like make up a story that, oh yeah, the fire alarm was actually going off in my dream, so I didn't need to wait, stuff like that, right? So you can have a fusion of the dream and the hallucinatory and the real all kind of mashed together.
So are we postulating here that the stress of being lost basically in the middle of nowhere was what put him into this state of delirium, or this catatonic state? Do you think that would have been enough to really kind of set him off and put him into this state you're describing, Brett?
So I have two postulates here. My first postulate is that he fell asleep on the flight and he didn't realize he fell asleep on the flight. He was having a waking dream. In my RV session data, I'm writing someone is having a hallucination. They are seeing something that's not really there. In his state of panic, he's in a cold sweat and he's saying to himself out loud, what in the hell am I seeing? Oh my goodness, what in the world is this? He never really states what it is, but at least as far as in the RV session, but it's not really there. It's this kind of out of body, dreamy state, but he's not really out of body. He's conked out on the actual aircraft. And so my data describes his body's curled up into a ball-like position and he's passed out. This is not a restful slumber, though. It seems that this individual is having a rather vivid hallucination. He's in a terrible cold sweat and his mind is elsewhere. My second postulate is that due to the stress, because if he was lost, perhaps there was something off kilter with him already that triggered kind of a predisposition to extreme stress that would have caused him to have waking hallucinations. Now, knowing his character, he was someone who did really crazy things. There was the backstory of the carbon monoxide potential poisoning. And I described this individual as there was something psychotic about him almost. He wasn't able to delineate what was real and what wasn't real. And so he certainly wasn't looking out the window of the aircraft and seeing UFOs. If anything, he was imagining there were UFOs out the window that weren't there, but he believed that were.
Being that he was the commanding officer of not only the mission at large, but he would have been the commanding officer on this flight, it seems pretty unlikely to me that your first postulate where he just fell asleep would have been as plausible as the fact that he was more sort of shocked, shell shocked, and maybe a little bit worried that they're completely lost and they're just going to die. They'd probably wake the commanding officer up if there was a problem with the flight. They wouldn't just let him sleep. I mean, maybe that they were in a really weird situation, so it's fine, let him doze off or something. But it does seem like he would have been more likely in a state of shock.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a valid postulate that the stress of being lost, the stress of not knowing where to go, losing communication, that could have overwhelmed his system. And I actually described that there's like a circuit frying effect that's going on with this individual. And it's actually affecting his ocular sight is how I perceived it. And he's seeing things in his eyes that aren't actually there. And so perhaps it was the stress of the situation that, oh my goodness, I'm in another world. There is no hope for rescue. If we don't get back, this is the end. Maybe that triggered something that he had a predisposition towards, which were these hallucinations and maybe ultimately passing out.
Well, I think there's many different factors that could be at play here, because we know this guy was given to extreme adventures, right? He spent 5 months, was it, underground in the Antarctic on his own. He wanted to be the first to fly over the poles. He was a person of extremes, and he was also in charge of this very large and quite perilous operation, right? So I think it's possible to say that he might have been stressed out, sleep deprived. He's already a bit of a knife edge kind of character, and here he is lost in some kind of aeronautical cock up, possibly about to die. I think there comes a point where you just snap, right? Where something just goes ding in your head, and your body will shut down your mind, or the whole system just collapses. Maybe it's a bit of a tenuous link, but think of near-death experiences, where like you're dead and you're having this great experience. Something completely different is happening in your awareness. And it's obviously not a perfect analogy, but like you can just overwhelm the physical organism to the point where the mind just goes nuts and goes inside of itself, right? So yeah, there could also have been carbon monoxide issues. Would have to ask somebody who knew about aeroplanes and engines and stuff, but maybe if they were running low on fuel, perhaps that could have exacerbated the risk of a carbon monoxide thing. I haven't the faintest idea, but I know carbon monoxide does cause hallucinations at kind of sub-fatal doses. So if you've got a stressed out, knife edge, crazy guy who's in charge of all this stuff, he's super stressed out, he's sleep deprived, he's lost in an aeroplane, he's about to die and might be being poisoned by gas at the same time. If he flips out and hallucinates, I can forgive him for it.
So, from some of the research I've done with people who have had not quite near death experiences, but experiences where their life is threatened to the point where they are feeling like death might be near, there are definitely reports that people experience almost like an out of body situation, like they physically disconnect from their body psychologically, and they end up off into another realm. Some people call it the astral realm. Some people report just floating above their body. But all sorts of really strange things can happen psychologically and maybe even metaphysically when someone is in a very, very high stress environment. And so that I think that squares pretty well with the data you've got, Brad. Does that make sense?
It does. And actually, your description of that triggered a personal memory of mine that might be of somewhat interest as a small tangent. I've actually experienced that. I experienced it when I was a very young child. I was about 4 years old at the beach, and I almost drowned because a big wave came in, swept my feet out from under me and pulled me out to sea. And as I was tumbling along, thankfully a surfer saw me and grabbed me before I could drown. But the surfer brought me back. My dad was right there. He grabbed me and we started, he made sure I was okay and carried me back to the apartment. The entire walk back to the apartment, my perception was about 5 feet outside my body, looking back at my 4-year-old body crying on the shoulder of my dad. And I was like, this is kind of weird. Why am I outside my body looking at myself crying? And I didn't have any of the emotions, but I was like, why is that little kid over there crying? It was very strange. So I've actually had a personal experience of moving my perception out of my body. This was totally unwilled. This was just as a result of the trauma as a result of the extreme stress and anxiety. So if that's what happened, I'm somewhat familiar with what that experience would be like. And I don't think that it's a far cry to say that this may have been what happened to Admiral Byrd here.
So, Brett, you had additional data that related to what I think ties back to when the Admiral did actually get back to his forward base camp and landed as a result of being lost, potentially, we're speculating here, had this psychotic breakdown. How would he have reacted once he actually landed his plane and he was greeted by presumably all of his fellow adventurers? They're so happy and relieved that he's back and he's alive. But if he's still in this psychotic state, how would he have reacted based on the data that you got in your session?
So I did get data kind of putting a capstone on this journey where he returns to a camp, this life form. There's a lot of other people there. And in the camp, he's yelling and screaming maniacally, kind of at the top of his lungs. It's almost like I got the impression like there's a fight about to begin, but there is no fight. And this just really leads in from this idea of he's lost his mind. His marbles are gone. And he's thinking he's seen things. There's this impression that he saw things out the window. I believe Admiral Byrd thought he saw people or strange things outside the window of the craft. And when he landed back at the camp, he's yelling at the top of his lungs, trying to tell everybody. And the issue is he's probably still in this manic state that he's not fully calmed down from. And the people are trying to figure out what to do. And so I describe in the RV data that there's a man that's pondering something intently. I'm hearing a tussle in the camp, like someone is getting roughed up, but I'm not sure why it's exactly occurring. It doesn't make sense. There are no fists flying. Someone is very panicked and in a state of tears. They're asking others to stop, please stop. There is no fighting, but it's like people are yelling at each other. So he gets back to the camp, and my postulate is he's still in a freaked out state. And people are trying to figure out what went on. He's probably telling them he's seen all these really weird things. He thinks he actually saw them. People are going, oh dear, the Admiral's lost his mind. And then eventually, well, that's where it ends. He ends up in his room pondering the events for the rest of the evening.
Interestingly enough, there are some reports that it's hard to trace this information down, but I did read some reports that the data in his journal was also reported by some people at this forward base camp. So things get a little bit murky here. So perhaps, Brett, what you just described may have actually been what Admiral Byrd later ended up writing in the journal, or perhaps there were people at the base camp that saw Admiral Byrd screaming about all the things he'd seen in his visions while he was on the plane, and then that ended up somehow in the journal. We really don't know. We're well into the realm of speculation here, but it does seem like some of our RV data does tie back into how something super strange happened to this individual while he was out on that flight, and it's somehow through various means of broken telephone or even perhaps just misperception of what's going on been distilled back into this journal.
It's like if I had a really vivid dream one evening and I woke up and I thought it was real, and I went and I told my friend, hey, I had this vivid dream and you were there and all these other things happened and some UFOs showed up and I swear it happened. And then someone overheard that story and wrote about it, and then they're passing it off 50 years later as the truth. Now, that was a real vivid dream that I had as a hallucination, but did it actually happen? Is there ground truth to the event? I would argue that my data is saying that is not the case, that this was a psychotic break. He lost his marbles. He thought he saw things, but none of this actually happened. That's purported in the journal.
If indeed he saw or experienced anything, right? Because maybe the journal isn't what actually happened to him. Maybe it's just a nice story. But assuming the journal is a record of his experience, then yeah, I totally agree. There's no woo-woo in my sessions.
My data doesn't support the stories of the journal. My data supports that he saw some strange things. He saw beings outside the aircraft somehow. He saw weird visions, but nothing about an underground race,
when you say he saw them outside the aircraft, this is when he's already curled up in a ball and he's not really looking out the window, right? He's just seeing them through
That's absolutely
the
right.
window that he's dreaming or hallucinating about.
Yeah.
And then all this stuff's coming into his consciousness. Because there is one thing from the consciousness angle that is interesting about this whole, oh, you are not ready for nuclear weapons, human beings, we have been watching you sort of thing. This message pops up regularly in like channeled material, and it's very vague, and it's very, oh, you must be careful of nukes, and you must be nice to each other and be vegetarians, and it, this there's kind of like there's a smell to this style of extremely vague hippy dippy new age message, right? That's none of what it's saying is necessarily bad or wrong, but it comes up in contexts where the source is questionable, or where the source is channeled material, or I banged my head and I had a vision, or insert deity of your choice gave me this message, or indeed, very popularly, the aliens gave me this message. You know, this sort of vague love and light message, just it keeps coming from different angles, right? So if we just link this back to our crop circles project that we recently did, there you've got people who are just like normal people, and suddenly they feel a weird inspiration to go and create this symbolic artwork, and they don't really know where that's coming from. So maybe this weird message, well, I don't know, it's not really a weird message, to be careful with nukes, is it? But maybe this kind of love and light, vague message filters its way into consciousness. Maybe this is even something in the collective unconscious, right? So when you get people in a real messed up open state, or who are deliberately doing practices like channeling where they're open to this message kind of bubbles up. And that's why it just keeps on popping up from these weird places. So just like those crop circle makers, maybe whoever wrote this journal, assuming it was not Byrd, was also kind of doing this, and then they thought, just like the crop circle people love to say that aliens made their circle with a UFO, even though they know full well they made it with boards. Maybe the person who wrote this was going, well, if I attribute this to Byrd and give it legitimacy, I'll legitimize this message, which is an important message that I really believe in. And so maybe the message they're genuine about, and they're co-opting the context from Byrd and his life story.
David, something that just jumped out at me while you were talking is, if this diary and this story and this message was really coming from Admiral Byrd, he had every opportunity to speak to the world before he got to the Pentagon when he was doing his interview with the Chilean newspaper. It's like, if this was his actual message that he was supposed to bring to the world, he's talking in these vague generalities about oh, there's a threat, and it sounds like an army guy. Oh, there's a threat. It's coming from the south. We got to prepare. We got to protect the country. There's nothing in there in his massive interview back in civilization about we have to abandon nukes and humanity is doomed. I mean, he could have even tempered the message and not gone into all the Aryan stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, he could have just slipped it in there. If he really needed to present it, he could have just slipped it in there and said, by the way, you know, I think nuclear war is a bad thing. Maybe we should be careful with that stuff. Anyway, Antarctica.
It's totally absent from that newspaper article as far as I can tell, which is very, very suspicious, and I think very telling.
Well, I think that there's an interesting tone to this article, which is very much at odds with the tone of the alleged journal. Shall I read this whole thing out? Because it's not very long. I can read this out for listeners, and then you can judge for yourselves whether you think the tone of this really matches up with whatever they're called, the Aryans, the space Nazis, and the message of nuclear peace. So here's a translation of the complete short interview from the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio on March 5th, 1947. Admiral Richard E. Byrd warned today that the United States should adopt measures of protection against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile planes coming from the polar regions. And I know some people will say, Nazi UFOs, I told you. I'm not convinced that's what he's talking about here. The Admiral explained that he was not trying to scare anybody, but the cruel reality is that in the case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles. This statement was made as part of a recapitulation of his own polar experience in an exclusive interview with International News Service. Talking about the recently completed expedition, Byrd said that the most important result of his observations and discoveries is the potential effect that they have in relation to the security of the United States. The fantastic speed with which the world is shrinking, recalled the admiral, is one of the most important lessons learned during his recent Antarctic exploration. I have to warn my compatriots that the time has ended when we were able to take refuge in our isolation and rely on the certainty that the distances, the oceans, and the poles were a guarantee of safety.
That's a man who has a message from an alien species.
That is a man who has a message from a long and illustrious career in the US Navy.
Yeah, it doesn't match.
That sounds very sensible and measured and grounded and completely reasonable to me. He doesn't even sound crazy.
I think once I take in all the information that's available in the research, once I take in the remote viewing data, what makes the most sense to me is that what happened to Admiral Byrd is he had a psychotic break. He saw things that weren't real. He was calmed down by his men. And then some of that was written about, perhaps in a journal, or that story leaked out somewhere, or someone else wrote about it. I don't necessarily believe that what is in that journal that is attributed to Byrd was written by Byrd. I think things were added, modified, adjusted for the narrative that the person who released it wanted to tell that story. And what was the story they wanted to tell? They wanted to tell the story that humans weren't ready for nuclear warheads, for atomic energy. That is the story they're trying to tell. And they used Admiral Byrd as a vehicle for that story because he's an epic character. He's someone who went to the great unknown. It's a viral thing back in that day that they could piggyback on to get people's attention that don't do nukes, not ready. And whether it was some spiritual thing hijacking somebody or it was just someone with an agenda that was political, I don't think it matters, because what does matter is that the actual story that's propagated online, in books, in stories, what we've uncovered with our remote viewing is it's just simply not true. It's another one of these issues where the grandiose epic saga is actually just that. It's fiction, it's fantasy, and it's not real.
There is one other way of looking at this that we haven't touched on yet, but I think it bears a brief discussion here. It's definitely a possibility that this diary itself is a bit of a psyop, that there perhaps is something in the Antarctic that they discovered, not necessarily on this trip, but in subsequent trips. And this diary has been put out as a way of telling a fantastical tale that when someone really starts looking at it closely, dismisses any type of strangeness or high strangeness coming out of the Antarctic. And I think possibly that's something that we can touch on in a future show in some further investigation.
So maybe the real Antarctica Nazis are the ones who published this to discredit all mention of their secret underground base.
I think that the person who would have the motive to publish disinformation about Antarctica is someone who knew there might be something else there that they don't want anyone else having access to. There is more work on this topic. There's more work that I've done on this topic that suggests a bigger story about the unknown continent of Antarctica. Even in more recent times, what's going on there. I think there will probably be a future follow-up show to this as we explore that work. But in regards to Admiral Byrd, everything's pretty above board. The guy just went through a pretty traumatic experience and someone piggybacked on that who had an agenda. Maybe. So I think that's where we're going to wrap this show up. I want to thank everybody for joining us on this adventure through space and time down to the snow-covered ice caps of the South Pole. It was definitely a fun remote viewing project, and even a fun one to get feedback on, to see some of the specifics of the expedition, the specifics of the flight and whatnot. So thank you, Emily, for setting this one up for us. We'll have more fantastical shows for you in the future with our remote viewing data. Please share our main show with your friends if you think that they would find this content interesting. You can also find us on social media at Cypher Podcast. We'd love to hear your feedback and engage with you. So until next time, we'll talk to you then. Take care, everybody.